In the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, a lone woman's compassion would ignite a firestorm of secrets and survival. She found him at death's door, a man with no name and a past shrouded in fevered whispers. She offered him shelter, tended his wounds, and slowly gave him a piece of her fractured heart. But the man she knew as Cole was a ghost. He was a phantom, living a stolen life, for his true name was Nantan, son of a great chief, and he was not just a drifter. He was the banished prince of the Chiricahua Apache. This is the story of a love that should never have been, and the violent truth that blood and destiny can never be outrun. The sky over the Dragoon Mountains had been the color of a fresh bruise for 3 days straight. Josephine Hobbs knew that shade of purple-gray meant the heavens were about to split open. She felt it in the ache of her knuckles and in the profound, electric silence that had fallen over the high desert. The cicadas were quiet. The hawks had vanished. Even the dust seemed to be holding its breath. Her ranch, a modest but sturdy homestead her late husband Frank had named Hobbs Hollow, was nestled in a shallow basin that offered some protection from the wind but collected the heat like a cast-iron skillet. It had been hers alone for 2 years now, 2 years of calloused hands, mended fences, and a loneliness so vast it felt like a second shadow. When the storm finally broke, it wasn't with rain, but with a ferocious, blinding squall of wind and sand that scoured the paint from her clapboard house. She'd just managed to wrestle the barn door shut, the wind fighting her like a living beast when she saw it, a shape dark and struggling near the dry creek bed that marked the edge of her property. At first, she thought it was one of her stray cattle disoriented by the gale, but as the figure staggered and fell, she saw the unmistakable silhouette of a man. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude and caution, screamed at her to bolt the door and wait it out. The territory was no place for a woman alone to be taking in strangers. Apaches, outlaws, desperate men of all stripes haunted these lands. Frank had warned her, his voice a low rumble of concern even on his deathbed. Don't trust shadows, Josie. And out here everyone's a shadow. But as another gust of wind tore across the plains, flipping the man over, she saw the dark stain spreading across his shirt. He wasn't just caught in the storm. He was wounded, dying. A flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, not pity, but a fierce, defiant empathy sparked in her chest. She couldn't leave him to the buzzards. That wasn't who she was. Wrapping a thick wool shawl around her head and shoulders, she leaned into the wind, the grit stinging her cheeks like tiny needles. It took all her strength to reach him. He was unconscious, his face a mask of dirt and sweat, matted black hair plastered to his forehead. His skin was scorching to the touch. A ragged, angry-looking gash, crusted with dirt and dried blood, ran along his ribs. It was festering. He was heavy, a dead weight of lean muscle and bone. She was a strong woman, made so by the land, but dragging him back to the house was a Herculean effort. Her lungs burned, her muscles screamed, but she gritted her teeth and pulled one agonizing foot at a time until they collapsed onto the relative safety of her porch. Inside, she laid him on a cot she kept in the main room, the one Frank used to sleep on when his cough was too bad. By the flickering lamplight, she finally got a proper look at him. He was younger than she'd thought, perhaps in his late 20s. His features were sharp, defined by high cheekbones and a strong jaw now slack in unconsciousness. His skin was a deep, sun-burnished copper, darker than any drifter she'd ever seen. He was clearly Native American, but his tribe was a mystery. He wore denim trousers worn thin at the knees and a simple cotton shirt, the clothes of a common ranch hand, not a warrior. There were no beads, no feathers, nothing to betray his origin. She worked through the night, a silent, desperate battle against the fever that consumed him. With a pair of scissors, she cut away the blood-soaked shirt. The wound was deep, inflamed, and oozing. Taking a deep breath, she sterilized her sharpest knife in the fire and cleaned the gash as best she could, her stomach churning at the man's pained, involuntary groans. She boiled water with yarrow and willow bark remedies an old Pima woman had taught her years ago, and forced the bitter tea between his parched lips. She bathed his face and chest with cool cloths, watching as the water evaporated almost instantly from his burning skin. In his delirium he spoke. Not English, but a torrent of guttural rhythmic words she didn't understand. The language was harsh and beautiful, flowing from him in raspy whispers and fevered cries. He spoke of eagles, of mountains, of a fire-haired woman, and a brother named Cato. He spoke a name over and over, with a tone of reverence, and pain mangas. For days he teetered on the precipice of death. Josephine barely slept, her world shrinking to the small cot and the man lying upon it. She found herself talking to him, her voice low and steady, filling the suffocating silence of the house. She told him about Frank, about her dreams of having a real garden, about the stubbornness of her old mule Jeremiah. She spoke of her fears, the ones that crept in during the dead of night, the fear of a dry well of sickness, of the predatory gaze of men like Bartholomew Slade. Slade was the vulture circling Hobbs Hollow. A wealthy cattle baron from Tucson, he'd made it known he wanted her land. Not for the grazing, which was poor, but for the one thing that made it invaluable, the deep, reliable spring that fed her well. In this parched land, water was more precious than gold, and Slade was a man who always got what he wanted. He had offered, then threatened. His foreman, a cruel-eyed man named Jedediah Stone, had paid her a visit just last month, his smile thin and menacing as he'd looked around her property. "A woman can't hold a place like this for long," he'd sneered. "Sooner or later, something gives." On the fourth day the fever broke. Josephine was dozing in her rocking chair, utterly exhausted, when a sound startled her awake. It was a faint, raspy whisper. "Water." Her eyes shot open. The stranger was awake. His eyes, the color of dark, wet earth, were open and fixed on her. They were lucid. The delirium was gone. She rushed to his side, her heart hammering against her ribs. She held a cup of water to his lips, supporting his head with her hand. He drank greedily, his throat bobbing. When he finished, he sank back against the pillow, his gaze never leaving her face. "Thank you," he managed, his voice a mere scratch. "You'll rest now," she said softly. "You've been very sick." He nodded slightly, his eyes drifting shut. A moment later he spoke again, so quietly, she almost missed it. "My name is Cole." Josephine studied his face, the sharp angles softened by exhaustion. Cole. It was a simple, unassuming name, a white man's name, but it felt wrong, like a poorly tailored coat on a man of his stature. It was a name a man would choose to hide behind. She didn't press. In the Arizona Territory, you didn't ask about a man's past. Sometimes it was the only kindness you could offer. For now he was just Cole, the man she had pulled from the storm, and for reasons she couldn't yet fathom, his presence in her quiet, lonely house felt less like a danger and more like a reckoning. Recovery was slow but steady. In the days that followed, a quiet routine settled over Hobbs's Hollow. Cole, as he continued to call himself, was a model patient, stoic, reserved, and deeply observant. He rarely spoke, unless spoken to, but his eyes missed nothing. He watched the way she kneaded bread, the way she mended a harness, the way she would pause at the window and stare out at the horizon, a flicker of worry in her expression. As his strength returned, he refused to remain idle. First it was small things. He insisted on sitting on the porch to whittle his long, deft fingers, carving a piece of cottonwood into a startlingly lifelike hawk. Then, against her protests, he began to take on chores. He mended the section of fence the storm had torn down, his movements economical and precise. He sharpened her axe until it could shave a whisker and reinforced the loose boards on the porch. He did it all with a silent competence that was both unnerving and deeply reassuring. He moved with a quiet grace, a fluidity that spoke of a life spent in open spaces, not behind a plough. Josephine found herself watching him. He was a paradox. His hands, though calloused, were not the clumsy, thick hands of a typical farmhand. They were clever, artistic. He knew the land not as a farmer did, but as a hunter. He could read the tracks of a coyote in the dust, predict the weather from the behavior of the ants, and find water where she saw only cracked earth. They spoke, but their conversations were like stepping stones across a wide, deep river of unspoken truths. He asked about the ranch, about her life. She told him of her childhood in Missouri, of meeting Frank, of their journey west in search of a life they could call their own. But when she gently tried to probe into his past, he would deflect with a vague answer or simply fall silent, his dark eyes growing distant. "Were you working a cattle drive?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun bleed across the sky. He considered the question for a long moment, turning the wooden hawk over in his hands. "Something like that," he said, his voice low. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. It was a wall. Despite the walls between them, a fragile intimacy began to grow. It was in the shared silence, the way he would hand her a tool before she asked for it, the way she would leave a plate of food for him without a word. For the first time in 2 years, the house didn't feel empty. The silence was no longer heavy with loss, but filled with a quiet, watchful presence. One sweltering afternoon, while cleaning out an old trunk of Frank's, Josephine's hand brushed against a false bottom. Her heart gave a little lurch. Frank had never been a man for secrets. Prying it open, she found a small, leather-bound ledger she'd never seen before. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The pages were filled with Frank's familiar looping script, but the words made no sense. They were lists of names, dates, and sums of money. Then she saw it written over and over again. B. Slade. Her blood ran cold. The ledger detailed a series of loans, each one larger than the last, all from Bartholomew Slade. The final entry, dated just a week before Frank's fatal bout of pneumonia, was not a loan. It was a contract. Her breath hitched in her throat as she read the spidery text. Frank, desperate and in debt, had signed an agreement to sell the water rights to Hobbs's Hollow to Slade for a pittance. He had been planning to sell the very soul of their dream, the one thing that made the ranch viable. The ledger fell from her hands. A wave of nausea and betrayal washed over her. The man she had mourned, the kind, simple man she had built a life with, had been lying to her. He had been in league with the very man who now threatened to destroy everything she had left. Her grief, once a clean, sharp pain, now felt sullied, twisted into something ugly and confusing. She stumbled outside, gasping for air, the ledger clutched in her hand. Cole was by the well drawing a bucket of water. He saw her face and was at her side in an instant, his expression a mixture of alarm and concern. "Josephine, what is it?" She couldn't speak. She just held out the ledger. He took it, his brow furrowed. He scanned the pages, his expression hardening with each line he read. He didn't need to ask for an explanation. The name Slade was enough. When he looked up, the usual quiet reserve in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fire. He was going to sell you out, Cole said, his voice flat and devoid of judgment. It was a simple statement of fact. A sob escaped her. I didn't know. I thought we were building this together. He didn't offer empty platitudes or clumsy words of comfort. He simply stood there, a solid, unwavering presence. After a long moment, he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. His touch was firm grounding. What Frank did or didn't do. That was his story, he said, his voice softer now. This ranch is your story now. You decide how it ends. His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was right. Frank was gone. His secrets and his debts were in the past. Her fight was here now. And looking at Cole, at the fierce loyalty burning in his dark eyes, she realized something with a terrifying jolt. She was no longer fighting it alone. The next day, the shadow they had been living under materialized. 2 riders appeared on the horizon, moving with the lazy arrogance of men who believe they own the world. It was Jedediah Stone and one of Slade's hired guns. Cole saw them first. He was on the roof replacing a loose shingle. He didn't shout or call out. He simply descended the ladder with a silent feline grace and moved to stand beside Josephine on the porch, his body subtly positioned slightly in front of hers. Jed Stone reined in his horse, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Josephine's feet. "Mornin', Mrs. Hobbs. See you've got yourself some help." His eyes raked over Cole, a sneer twisting his lips. "Didn't take you for one to hire on strays, especially not his kind." The slur hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Josephine bristled, but before she could speak, Cole's voice cut through the tension, calm and cold as Riverstone. She needed a hand. "I'm providing it." Jed's eyes narrowed. "That's a well the work's about to dry up. Mr. Slade sent me to deliver his final offer. He knows about your husband's contract. He's willing to forget the debt and give you $500 for the deed. You take it and walk away. Or you don't, and we foreclose on the debt." "This is my land," Josephine said, her voice shaking but defiant. "It's not for sale." Jed chuckled a low, ugly sound. "Everything's for sale, Mum. You got 1 week. After that, the offer's off the table, and we'll just take what's legally ours." He turned his venomous gaze back to Cole. "And you, whatever she's paying you, I'd be long gone by then. This place is about to get unhealthy." He spurred his horse, kicking up a cloud of dust as he and the other rider galloped away. Josephine stood trembling, a mixture of fear and rage churning inside her. She looked at Cole. He was staring after the riders, his jaw tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The quiet drifter was gone. In his place stood someone else, a man coiled with a dangerous energy she had never seen before. He was no longer just a man she was helping. He was a man who had chosen to stand with her, to face the coming storm, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that Jedediah Stone had just made a terrible, terrible mistake. He hadn't just threatened a lone widow, he had provoked the hawk she had unknowingly sheltered. The week that followed was thick with a tension that felt heavier than the summer heat. The unspoken threat lingered in the air, a constant presence on the horizon, just like the distant silhouette of Slade's sprawling ranch. But fear was a luxury Josephine could no longer afford. Fueled by a new hard-won resolve, she and Cole worked from sunup to sundown, fortifying the ranch not for profit, but for a siege. Cole was transformed. The quiet, reserved man became a focused, tireless force of nature. He wasn't just fixing things. He was assessing them with a strategist's eye. He taught Josephine how to reinforce the window shutters from the inside, not just to keep out the dust, but to stop a bullet. He cleared the brush from around the house, creating a wide open space that offered no cover. A man can't sneak up on you if he has nowhere to hide. he explained, his tone practical, devoid of alarm. It was during this time that Josephine began to see the true depths of the man she called Cole. His skills went far beyond those of a simple ranch hand. One afternoon, while checking the perimeter, a large rattlesnake spooked from its hiding place, coiled, and struck at her. Before she could even cry out, Cole moved with a speed that defied belief. In a blur of motion, he snatched a rock from the ground and hurled it with pinpoint accuracy, striking the snake's head and killing it instantly. He stood over it, breathing heavily, his body taut like a drawn bowstring. Josephine stared, her heart pounding in her throat, not from the snake, but from the impossible swiftness of his action. "How did you—" He didn't look at her. "I've dealt with snakes before," he said, his voice tight. He nudged the dead reptile with his boot, then walked away, leaving her to grapple with the image of his lightning-fast, lethal precision. His senses were preternaturally sharp. He could hear riders from miles away, distinguish the call of a hawk from that of a vulture, and feel shifts in the wind that she completely missed. He taught her to listen, truly listen to the language of the desert. He showed her how to use the sun's reflection on a piece of glass to signal over long distances, and how to build a fire that produced almost no smoke. These were not the skills of a drifter. They were the skills of a warrior, the skills of an Apache. Her suspicion, once a quiet whisper in the back of her mind, now grew into a persistent hum. She thought back to his fevered ramblings, to the melodic alien words he had spoken. She looked at the hawk he had carved, its lines, perfect and fierce, an emblem of power. She watched him move silent and sure-footed, and saw not a man named Cole, but a man who was profoundly, intrinsically tied to the very land Slade sought to conquer. One evening, as dusk settled, he was skinning a rabbit for their dinner. His back was to her, and his shirt had ridden up slightly, exposing the skin just above his trousers. There, etched onto his back, was a tattoo. It was a simple, elegant design, in dark pigment. A soaring bird of prey, its wings outstretched. An eagle or a hawk. It was a tribal marking. She was sure of it. She must have made a sound because he froze, then slowly turned, pulling his shirt down. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before, vulnerability. He knew what she had seen. The air crackled with the unspoken question, but the moment was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats. Cole was instantly alert, his head cocked. "One rider," he said, his voice low. Moving slow. Not stone. They waited on the porch, Josephine with her father's old shotgun resting in her lap. Cole standing beside her, unnervingly still. The rider emerged from the twilight, a young man barely out of his teens from a neighboring small holding. He looked terrified. "Mrs. Hobbs," he gasped, reining in his lathered horse. "It's Slade. He's cleared out the Petersons. Just told them to leave. Burned their barn when they argued." He wrung his hat in his hands. "He's coming for everyone who won't sell. My pa says he's on a rampage. Says you're next." After the boy left, a heavy silence fell. The threat was no longer an abstraction. It had a name, Peterson, and the smell of smoke. "You should go," Josephine said, her voice flat. She couldn't meet his eyes. "This isn't your fight, Cole. I pulled you from that storm. I won't have you die in this one." He was silent for a long time. The crickets began their nightly chorus, oblivious to the human drama unfolding. "Where would I go, Josephine?" he finally asked. His voice was quiet, laced with a weariness that seemed to go beyond mere physical exhaustion. "There is no place for me. Not back there." He gestured vaguely towards the mountains. "And not out here." He looked at her, then his gaze intense, searching. "This fight, This is the only one that makes sense. To defend a piece of land that is good. To defend a person who is good." He paused. "My people have been fighting for that for 100 years. Slade is just another man with a greedy heart. I know how to fight men like him." The admission hung between them. My people. He hadn't said it by accident. It was a crack in the wall he had so carefully constructed. He was testing her, waiting to see if she would flinch, if she would recoil from the truth that was becoming blindingly obvious. Josephine looked from his earnest, troubled face to the vast, dark expanse of the territory around them. The world was full of predators and victims. For 2 years she had been trying desperately not to be the latter. Now this man, this mystery, was offering to be her shield. But what was the cost of accepting help from a man whose very existence was a secret? Who was he running from? Who was the brother Cato he had cried out for? And what was the significance of the name that had haunted his fever-mongers? The questions swirled in her mind, unanswered and dangerous. But looking at him, at the quiet strength in his posture, she knew one thing for sure. Whatever his past, his present was here, with her. And with Slade's deadline expired, their shared present was about to erupt in violence. The morning of the 8th day dawned with an unnatural stillness. There was no breeze, no bird song, just the oppressive weight of the sun climbing a bleached white sky. The deadline had passed. It wasn't a question of if Slade would come, but when. Cole was a study in controlled tension. He had spent the dawn hours checking their preparations, his movements deliberate and precise. He had Frank's old rifle cleaned and oiled, leaning against the porch railing. He had positioned 2 buckets of water inside the front door to douse any fires. His focus was absolute, yet his eyes kept scanning the horizon, looking not just for the dust cloud of Slade's men, but for something else. Something he seemed to be dreading and expecting in equal measure. Josephine's fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she refused to let it paralyze her. She baked bread, the familiar methodical action, a small rebellion against the chaos to come. As she worked, she watched Cole. The name he'd spoken in his fever-mongers echoed in her mind. She had heard that name before. It was the name of a legendary Apache chief, a fierce leader of the Chiricahua people. A man said to have a son who had vanished after a bitter dispute, a son who had argued for peace in a time of war. The pieces began to click into place with terrifying clarity. Around midday, 3 riders appeared. It was Jed Stone, flanked by 2 of Slade's hired thugs. They stopped just outside rifle range, the heat shimmering around them, distorting their figures into demonic shapes. "Last chance, Hobbs!" Jed bellowed his voice, carrying across the unnerving silence. "Sign the deed and we let you walk. You got 1 hour." Josephine stepped onto the porch, the shotgun feeling heavy and clumsy in her hands. Cole stood beside her, the rifle held loosely at his side. "I've given you my answer," she shouted back, her voice stronger than she felt. Jed laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Wrong answer." He raised his pistol and fired a shot into the air. It was a signal. From behind a low ridge to the east, another 6 riders emerged, spreading out to encircle the homestead. Slade wasn't just foreclosing, he was launching an assault. "Get inside," Cole said, his voice, a low, urgent command. He pushed her gently toward the door. "Stay away from the windows." The first bullet splintered the wood of the porch railing inches from his head. He didn't flinch. He dropped to one knee, raised the rifle to his shoulder, and fired. It was not the hurried, panicked shot of a farmer, but the calm, measured action of a marksman. One of the riders screamed and tumbled from his saddle. The world erupted into a cacophony of gunfire, shouting, and the thunder of hooves. Bullets tore through the walls of the small house, shattering glass and punching holes in the clapboard. Josephine crouched by the hearth, her heart hammering against her ribs, reloading the shotgun as Cole had shown her. He was a whirlwind of deadly efficiency. He moved from window to window, never staying in one place for more than a second, firing with an economy of motion that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. He wasn't just shooting, he was fighting a war he had clearly fought before. He anticipated their movements, used the angles of the house for cover, and made every single shot count. But they were outnumbered. 2 more of Slade's men went down, but the rest were closing in, using the terrain for cover, advancing on the house. "They're going to burn us out," Josephine cried, seeing one of the men preparing a torch. Cole's face was grim, streaked with sweat and grime. He knew she was right. They were trapped. He fired again, forcing the man with the torch back, behind a rocky outcrop. He was buying them seconds, nothing more. It was then that he began to chant. Under the roar of the gunfire, he began a low, rhythmic incantation in the language she had heard in his fever. It was not a prayer of desperation, but a warrior's song, a declaration of defiance to the gods and his enemies. The sound filled the small house, ancient and powerful, a sound that did not belong to a man named Cole. Jed Stone, enraged by the resistance, made a bold move. Under the cover of his men's fire, he charged the house on horseback, leaning low over his saddle, his pistol blazing. He was aiming for the front window where Cole had been a moment before. Cole saw him coming. He knew he couldn't get a clear shot in time. In that split second, with death bearing down on them, he made a choice. He dropped the rifle, grabbed the heavy oak table, and with a guttural roar that seemed to shake the foundations of the house, he heaved it through the front window, shattering the frame. The heavy table crashed into Stone's horse. The animal shrieked, reared, and threw its rider to the ground. Jed lay stunned for a moment, before scrambling to his feet, his face a mask of fury. He was just a few yards from the porch. The other men, seeing their leader's charge, began to advance more aggressively. This was the end. Cole stepped through the shattered window frame onto the porch, drawing a long, wicked-looking knife from his boot. He stood there silhouetted against the dark interior of the house, a fearsome, primitive figure. The drifter was gone completely. "You wanted this land, Stone." He yelled, his voice ringing with an authority that stunned every man on the field into a momentary silence. "You will have to kill me to take it, but know who it is that sends you to your hell." He stood taller, his shoulders thrown back, his chin lifted in an expression of absolute defiant pride. "I am not Cole. My name is Nantan. I am the son of Mangus, chief of the Chiricahua. This land is under my protection. To attack this house is to declare war on the Apache." A collective gasp went through Slade's men. Even Jed Stone froze, his pistol half raised his face, paling beneath the grime. The name Mangus was a legend, a name that struck fear into the hearts of settlers and soldiers alike. The idea that this lone man was the chief's son, a prince of the most feared tribe in the territory, was inconceivable. It was also, they suddenly realized, terrifyingly possible. It explained his skill, his ferocity, his utter lack of fear. Josephine, watching from the doorway, felt the world tilt on its axis. Nantan, son of Mangus, a banished prince. The stranger she had pulled from the storm, the quiet man who had mended her fences and shared her table, was Apache royalty. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, and in his desperation to save her, he had just sacrificed his secret, his anonymity, and quite possibly his life. He had revealed his true self, not in a quiet confession, but in a roar of defiance in the face of death. The revelation hung in the air, more potent than gunpowder smoke. Nantan's declaration had shattered the simple narrative of a land grab. This was no longer just an attack on a helpless widow. It was an assault on the son of a living legend. The hired gunsmen, motivated by pay and bullying, not by suicidal courage, exchanged nervous glances. They had signed up to scare off a woman, not to start a war with the Chiricahua. Jed Stone, however, was caught between his fear of the Apache and his greater fear of Bartholomew Slade. He snarled, recovering his bravado. "Liar, you're just some half-breed, trying to save his skin." But the hesitation was all Nantan needed. Before Jed could rally his men, a high, piercing cry echoed from the hills behind the ranch, the sound of a hawk. It was answered by another, and then another. Nantan's head snapped up, a look of profound shock and conflict on his face. It wasn't his signal. He hadn't called them. From the very same ridge where Slade's men had appeared, a new group of riders emerged. They were not cowboys. They were bare-chested, armed with rifles and bows, their faces painted for war. They moved with the terrifying, fluid grace of born horsemen. They were Apache. At their lead was a warrior who bore a striking resemblance to Nantan, though his features were harder, his eyes colder. He saw Nantan standing on the porch, the white woman behind him, the battle raging around them. A look of fierce, complicated emotion, anger, relief, contempt crossed his face. It was Cato, Nantan's brother. Slade's men, caught between the defiant prince on the porch and the war party on the ridge, broke. Their nerve shattered completely. Two of them threw down their guns and spurred their horses in a desperate retreat. The others, including a stunned Jedediah Stone, quickly followed, scrambling away in a panicked cloud of dust. They didn't even bother to retrieve their fallen. The homestead fell silent once more, the only sounds the buzzing of flies and the pained groans of a wounded gunman. Cato and his warriors did not charge. They remained on the ridge, a silent, menacing jury, their eyes fixed on the house. Their eyes were fixed on Nantan. Slowly Nantan lowered his knife. The warrior's fire in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a deep, bone-weary sadness. He turned and looked at Josephine. The revelation, the battle, the sudden appearance of the war party. It was too much. Josephine stumbled back into the house, her mind reeling. He wasn't Cole. He was Nantan. He was the enemy she had been taught to fear her entire life. Stories of Apache raids, of violence and savagery, were the ghost stories of the territory, whispered around campfires and printed in sensational newspaper articles. And she had let one of them into her home. She had nursed him, talked to him, felt a connection with him that ran deeper than any she had felt, even with Frank. Her world, which had already been shaken by her late husband's betrayal, now crumbled completely. Who was this man? What did he want? Was his protection just another form of conquest? He walked back inside his movements, heavy. He stopped in the center of the room, the space between them feeling like a vast, unbridgeable canyon. "Josephine," he began, his voice raspy. "Is it true?" she whispered, her back pressed against the far wall. "Everything you said." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "My name is Nantan. My father is Mangus. I left my people 2 seasons ago. I was banished." "Banished? Why?" A shadow passed over his face. "My father sees only one path war, until the last white man is driven from our lands. I argued for another way. For a peace that was not surrender. I spoke of a future where our people could live, not just die, fighting. He called my words poison. He called me weak, a white man in an Apache's skin. He said I was no longer his son, and told me to go live with the people I sought to understand." The story poured out of him, a torrent of pain and conviction. He had wandered, taking odd jobs on ranches, using the name Cole, trying to understand the world his father so despised. He was looking for proof that his vision of peace was possible, but had found mostly greed and hatred, culminating in the skirmish that had left him wounded and feverish on her doorstep. As she listened, Josephine's fear began to recede, replaced by a profound aching sorrow. He was not a monster. He was an outcast, a prince without a kingdom, a visionary without a people. He was more alone than even she was. Her mind flashed to the ledger to Frank's secret betrayal. She had been married to a man who had lied to her every day, a man who had been willing to sell their future for a handful of coins. And now she was facing a man who had just risked everything, his hidden life, his very future, to protect her. One man's secrets were born of weakness and deceit. The others were born of survival and a deep internal conflict. She walked slowly across the room, past the overturned furniture and shattered glass. She stopped in front of him and looked up into his face. She saw the pain in his eyes, the deep lines of weariness, the desperate hope that she would not turn away from him. "My husband," she said, her voice quiet but clear, "lied to me to save himself. You lied to me to save yourself. But when the time came to fight, he had already sold me out, and you were willing to die for me." She reached out her hand, trembling slightly, and laid it on his arm. His muscles were tense beneath her touch. "I don't know who Nantan is," she said softly. "I'm not sure I understand what any of this means, but I know Cole. I know the man who mended my fence, who killed the snake, who stood on my porch and faced down a dozen guns for me." A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He had expected fear, revulsion, hatred. He had not expected this quiet, courageous act of acceptance. Outside, a single rider detached from the group on the ridge and began to ride slowly toward the house. It was Cato. The time for explanations was over. The past had arrived at their door, and Nantan would be forced to choose between the world he had lost and the one he had just against all odds found. The house was no longer divided by her fear or his secret. Now it was a tiny, fragile island in a war between two worlds, and Nantan stood squarely in the middle. Cato reined in his horse a stone's throw from the porch. He sat tall and impassive, a living embodiment of the Apache way Nantan had left behind. His eyes, as dark and sharp as his brother's, flickered from Nantan to Josephine, lingering on her with cold disdain. "My brother bleeds for the white eyes now," Cato called out, his voice sharp with contempt. He spoke in English, a clear and deliberate insult. "He builds their fences and sleeps in their box houses." "They attacked this house, Cato." Nantan replied, his voice strained. "They attacked this woman. She gave me shelter when I was dying." "She is one of them," Cato shot back, gesturing with his rifle to the sprawling territory. "They are a plague. They poison the water and scar the land. Father was right. Your heart has gone soft." The tense exchange was cut short by a sound that chilled them all to the bone, the thunder of a much larger group of riders approaching from the direction of Slade's ranch. Nantan and Cato turned as one. On the horizon, a thick column of dust was rising. This was not a small group of thugs. This looked to be 20, maybe 30 men. Bartholomew Slade, humiliated by the retreat of his foreman, was not a man to accept defeat. He had emptied his ranch, armed every man he could find, and was riding to personally oversee the annihilation of Hobbs's Hollow. He was coming to wipe the insult, and everyone associated with it, from the face of the earth. Cato's face hardened. His small band of warriors was skilled, but they were outnumbered. He looked from the approaching dust cloud to his brother, then to the house. His fight was with the white man, But his immediate problem was one of survival. "They come for you, brother," Kaito said, a grim understanding dawning in his eyes. "But their bullets will not know the difference between a banished son and a warrior of the people." Nantan looked at Josephine, who stood in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. Then he looked at his brother. "Fight with me, Kaito. Not for her, not for this house. Fight for the honor of our name. We do not let men like that." He gestured towards the approaching mob. "Believe they can slaughter the son of Mangas without consequence." He spoke to his brother's pride, the one thing he knew would resonate more than logic or sentiment. Kaito hesitated for only a second. He let out a sharp, barking cry, a command to his warriors. In an instant they dismounted, taking cover behind the rocks and ridges surrounding the homestead, their rifles and bows at the ready. A fragile, unspoken alliance was forged in the face of a common enemy. The next hour was a brutal, desperate battle. Slade's men fueled by whiskey and the promise of a bonus charged with reckless abandon. But they were not soldiers. They were cowboys and hired guns accustomed to intimidating, unarmed homesteaders. They were unprepared for the tactical brilliance they now faced. Nantan directed the defense from the house, his voice sharp, with commands in his native tongue that Kaito and his men understood instantly. He turned the homestead into a fortress. Josephine, her fear burned away by adrenaline-loaded rifles with a steady hand, handing them to Nantan. As he moved from window to window, her presence a silent, unwavering support. She was no longer a victim to be protected. She was part of the defense. Outside, Kaito and his warriors were phantoms of death. They moved from rock to rock, silent and unseen, their arrows finding their marks with lethal precision, their rifle shots picking off Slade's men who were foolish enough to expose themselves. They fought with the ferocity of men defending their world, their fury stoked by generations of conflict. Slade, watching from a safe distance, grew more and more enraged as his forces were whittled down. He was a businessman, and this was becoming a costly, bloody mess. "Burn them out!" he roared, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "I want that house in ashes." Several men under the command of a newly arrived Jedediah Stone, his face a mask of vengeful fury, began to advance with torches and oil. This was the moment of truth. They could defend against bullets, but they couldn't stop a fire. Nantan saw the advance. "Josephine, the water!" he yelled. They worked together, soaking blankets in the buckets of water he had prepared earlier. But as Nantan moved to block a window, a bullet tore through the wall, catching him high in the shoulder. He cried out, staggering back, the rifle clattering to the floor. Josephine rushed to his side, tearing a strip from her apron to stanch the bleeding. "You're hit. It's nothing," he grunted, but his face was pale and his arm hung uselessly at his side. At that moment, Jed Stone and two other men reached the porch, hurling their torches onto the dry wood of the roof. Flames erupted, licking up the side of the house with a hungry roar. Smoke began to fill the room. They were trapped. Seeing his brother fall and the house ignite, Kaito let out a cry of pure rage. This was no longer a tactical battle. It was personal. He rose from behind his cover and issued a chilling war cry. His warriors answered, and in a terrifying, coordinated wave, they abandoned their cover and charged. The Apache warriors crashed into Slade's remaining men in a brutal flurry of knives, tomahawks and rifles fired at point-blank range. The disciplined firefight devolved into a chaotic, savage melee. Kaito fought like a demon, his movements a blur of lethal grace, cutting a path directly toward Jed Stone, who was trying to rally his crumbling forces. Inside the burning house, Nantan struggled to his feet, his knife in his good hand. "We have to get out!" He choked the smoke searing his lungs. He pushed Josephine toward the back door. As they stumbled out into the yard, they came face to face with Bartholomew Slade himself. The cattle baron had ridden forward to witness his victory, but now found himself in the middle of a slaughter. His face was a mixture of shock and terror. He raised his ornate silver-inlaid pistol and aimed it at Nantan. You cost me everything, you savage," Slade hissed. Before he could fire, a shot rang out not from an Apache rifle but from the shotgun in Josephine's hands. She had scooped it up on their way out the door. The blast caught Slade square in the chest, throwing him from his saddle. He landed in a heap, his reign of terror over. The death of their leader was the final blow. The last of Slade's men broke and fled with Cato and his warriors, in pursuit, their victory cries echoing across the valley. Nantan and Josephine stood in the yard amidst the bodies, and the smoke, watching her home, her past, burn to the ground. He was wounded, she was homeless, and all around them lay the brutal cost of their stand. Cato, his face grim, walked back toward them, his rage sated, but the future no clearer. The battle for Hobbs's Hollow was over, but the war for their lives had just begun. The rising sun cast long, mournful shadows across the battlefield. The smoke still rising from the smouldering ruins of the house was the only thing moving in the quiet dawn. The bodies of Slade's men had been left where they fell, a stark testament to the ferocity of the battle. Cato's warriors had lost 2 of their own, and their bodies were being prepared for their final journey with solemn, quiet reverence. Josephine had spent the last hours of the night tending to Nantan's shoulder, her hands surprisingly steady, as she cleaned and bound the wound by the light of the rising moon. The physical act of caring for him was a tether to sanity in a world that had come completely undone. Everything she owned, every link to her past with Frank, was now ash. All she had left was her life, and the life of the man who had turned her world upside down to save it. As the sun cleared the mountains, Cato approached them. He stopped before his brother, his eyes taking in the makeshift bandage, the weariness on Nantan's face, and the woman who stood steadfastly by his side. The open hostility was gone, replaced by a grudging, complex respect. "You fought well, brother," Cato said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "You have not forgotten the ways of the people." "I have never forgotten who I am," Nantan replied, his voice hoarse. "I only sought a different path." "Your path led you here," Cato said, gesturing to the devastation. "To a war for a White Eyes land. Our warriors died on this ground." The accusation was gentle but sharp. "Come home, Nantan. Father's heart is hard, but he grieves for his lost son. The victory today will be a song sung in our camp. They will say, 'You led us against the invaders. Your banishment can be undone. Come back to us.'" It was the offer Nantan had once dreamed of. A path home, a return to his people, to the life he had been born to lead. He looked at Cato, his brother, the living link to his past. Then his gaze shifted to Josephine. She stood listening, her face betraying no emotion, though her heart felt as if it were being squeezed in a vice. She expected him to go. It was his world, his family. She was nothing but a complication, a woman with no home, and a future as barren as the land around her. She had saved him, and he had saved her. Perhaps the debt was paid. Nantan saw the quiet resignation in her eyes. He saw the woman who had looked past his race, past his secrets, and had seen the man beneath. In his world he was a prince, a warrior, a symbol. With her he was just a man. He was Cole, and he was Nantan, and she had accepted both. "My path is here now, Cato," Nantan said softly, his decision settling in his soul with the weight of granite. Cato stared, disbelieving. Here with her in a world of ashes. There is nothing for you here. You are one of us. I am Nantan, agreed, but I have learned something in my time away. A home is not just the land you are born on. It is the person you are willing to die for. He looked directly at Josephine, his meaning unmistakable. My fight is no longer just for the past of our people. It is for a future. Her future. Our future. Here. He knew what he was asking. It was not just a life with him, but a life on the dangerous frontier between two worlds that hated each other. They would be outcasts from both. Settlers would see her as a traitor, and his people would see him as one. Understanding final and profound dawned on Cato's face. He had not found the brother he had lost. He had found a new man forged in a fire he could not comprehend. He nodded slowly, a gesture of parting. Then you are truly lost to us, he said, the words laced with sorrow, not anger. He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and led his warriors away, melting back into the mountains, leaving Nantan and Josephine utterly alone. They stood in the silence, the smoking ruins of her old life behind them, and a vast, uncertain future ahead. Josephine walked to him and took his good hand, her calloused fingers lacing with his. "Are you sure?" she whispered. He squeezed her hand, his dark eyes meeting hers, full of pain, love, and a fierce, unwavering certainty. "I have never been more sure of anything," Nantan said. They did not know what tomorrow would bring. They had no home, no allies, and enemies on all sides. But as they stood together, watching the sun climb higher into the sky, they were not a banished prince and a lonely widow. They were simply a man and a woman who had chosen each other over everything else, ready to build a new life, not on the ashes of the old, but on the hard, unforgiving, and promising ground of the Arizona Territory. And so the story of Nantan and Josephine was not an ending, but a new, dangerous beginning. They chose a path of impossible love in a world that recognized only hatred and division. Their tale reminds us that heroes are not always the ones who win the glorious war, but often the ones who have the courage to build a fragile peace in their own small corner of the world. It's a story of identity sacrifice, and the radical idea that home isn't a place you're from, but a person you refuse to leave. If their story of survival and defiance resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button. It truly helps our channel grow. Share this video with someone else who loves a powerful story from the Old West. And most importantly, if you haven't already, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next journey into the heart of history. Thank you for listening.